23 men sat down to supper at Belmont Plantation on Thanksgiving night, 1868. By dawn, 11 were dead, their bodies arranged in a perfect circle around the dining table, each man's hand reaching toward the centerpiece, a hollowed pumpkin filled with salt. The county marshal found no signs of struggle, no overturned chairs, no shattered crystal. The table settings remained pristine, except for 11 empty dessert plates rimmed with dark residue and the faint smell of bitter almonds. The kitchen staff had vanished, every pot scrubbed clean, every knife accounted for and hanging in place, every door to the cookhouse standing open to the November wind. On the servant's bell rope, someone had tied 11 knots, one for each body. The only sound in the big house was the grandfather clock in the hall, still ticking, marking time in a world that had stopped making sense somewhere between the blessing and the pie. The Mississippi Delta in 1868 was a place caught between two versions of itself, unable to become either. 3 years after Appomattox, the land still produced cotton, but the mathematics of production had changed in ways that made white planters furious and black workers cautious. The Freedmen's Bureau operated an office in Greenville, 20 miles north of Belmont Plantation, but its power extended only as far as the federal troops who enforced it, and those troops were being recalled month by month, leaving freed people to negotiate with former masters who had never stopped thinking of negotiation as a form of theft. Belmont sat on 4,000 acres of alluvial soil so rich it could grow anything except justice. The plantation had belonged to the Crenshaw family since 1822, passed from father to son with the kind of inevitability that wealthy white families mistook for divine endorsement. The main house was Greek Revival, white columns and black shutters, built to intimidate anyone approaching up the Magnolia Line Drive. Behind it stood the gin house, the stables, the overseer cottages, and what had been the quarters before emancipation, but were now called, with deliberate irony, the workers' settlement. 53 families lived there in 1868, working the land for wages so low they barely covered the cost of buying supplies from the plantation store, a system that kept people technically free but functionally bound. Marcus Crenshaw owned Belmont and everything his eyes could see from the second-floor gallery. He was 47 years old in November of 1868, a widower, father of 2 grown sons who had survived the war and returned home with the particular bitterness of men who believed they had been cheated of victory by circumstance rather than defeated by superior force. Marcus had adapted to Reconstruction with the flexibility of a man who understood that power had many forms, and if he could no longer own people outright, he could still control their labor through debt, through fear, through the manipulation of every system that supposedly protected them. The Thanksgiving announcement came on November 20th. Marcus had his overseer, a man named Clayton Webb, ride through the settlement that morning, stopping at each cabin to deliver the news. There would be a feast at the big house on Thanksgiving night. All workers were invited. Attendance was expected. Webb made the invitation sound like a benevolence, but everyone who heard it understood the threat underneath. This was not a celebration. This was a performance, a ritual meant to restore the old order under the new laws. November 20th, 1868, from the diary of Reverend Thomas Ashford, circuit preacher. Brother Webb came by the church site today with word of a Thanksgiving gathering at the big house. The workers are afraid. They remember the last celebration, when Mr. Crenshaw had 3 men whipped in the yard for arriving late. I counseled trust in the Lord's justice, but I could see in their eyes they trust nothing that comes from that house. Mercy Cato heard the invitation in her kitchen at dawn, Clayton Webb's voice carrying through the open door of the cookhouse where she had worked since she was 14 years old. She was 52 now, a woman whose hands bore the scars of decades spent over open flames and hot iron. She had been enslaved at Belmont until 1865, then had stayed on as a paid cook, not because she wanted to, but because leaving meant abandoning the place where her son was buried. His name had been Daniel. He had been 19 years old when he died in February of 1867, whipped to death in the barn for the crime of speaking to Marcus Crenshaw without lowering his eyes. The official cause of death, according to the county coroner, was fever. No charges were filed. Mercy had tried to leave after that, had walked the 20 miles to Greenville to speak with the Freedmen's Bureau agent, a Union captain named Harrison, who listened to her story with genuine sympathy and then explained that without witnesses willing to testify, there was nothing he could do. Everyone who had been in that barn worked for Marcus Crenshaw. Everyone had families. Everyone understood that speaking meant death or disappearance, and the law that supposedly protected them was enforced by men who had fought for the Confederacy and been pardoned by a president who wanted peace more than he wanted justice. So Mercy had returned to Belmont. She cooked the meals that fed the men who had killed her son. She served them with steady hands and a face that showed nothing. And she waited. The planning for the Thanksgiving supper began 6 days before the event. Marcus Crenshaw gave Mercy a list of dishes he wanted prepared, a menu designed to demonstrate abundance and restoration. Roasted turkey, glazed ham, cornbread stuffing, sweet potato casserole, collard greens, butter beans, cranberry preserve, 3 kinds of pie. The cost of the ingredients alone would have fed the workers' settlement for a month, but that was the point. This was theater, a demonstration that the plantation still had wealth, still had power, still functioned according to the natural order that Marcus believed God and history had established. Mercy worked alongside 3 other women from the settlement: Sarah Trent, who did the washing and mending, Abigail Foster, who tended the kitchen garden, and Ruth Parsons, who had been the dairymaid before the war and now managed the chickens and the small herd of milk cows. All 4 women had lost people during the transition from slavery to freedom. Sarah's husband had been sold away before the war and never found. Abigail's daughter had died of typhoid in 1866, while the Freedmen's Bureau doctor was delayed by flooded roads. Ruth's brother had been shot by a night rider in 1867 for trying to vote in the county election. They prepared the food in silence, the kind of silence that carries its own language. Each woman understood what the others were thinking without needing to say it aloud. They had all attended the previous plantation gatherings, the 4th of July celebration, where Marcus had given a speech about the natural harmony between the races, the Christmas dinner where he had handed out small gifts and expected gratitude that felt like swallowing stones. They knew this Thanksgiving feast would be worse because it was coming after a year of increasing violence, a year when every gain the freed people made, a successful crop on rented land, a school opened in the settlement, a delegation to the Freedmen's Bureau, was met with retaliation that left someone dead or a family burned out of their cabin. On November 22nd, 2 days before the feast, Marcus held a meeting in his study with his inner circle. His 2 sons, James and William, Clayton Webb, the overseer, and 3 other white men who served as foremen on different sections of the plantation. They drank whiskey and discussed what they called the winter tally, a plan to identify which workers could be let go after the harvest was complete, which families could be evicted from the settlement to make room for more tractable labor brought in from other counties. The conversation was loud enough to carry through the floorboards to the kitchen below, where Mercy was preparing the dough for the Thanksgiving pies. She heard Clayton Webb's voice clearly. "We keep the ones who remember their place and cut loose the troublemakers. That preacher who's been teaching reading at the church, he needs to go. The Trent boy who wrote that letter to the Bureau about the wages, he needs a lesson. And that whole Johnson family, they've been nothing but agitation since the father came back from the army. James Crenshaw, Marcus's eldest, added, "The feast is the perfect time to make the announcement. Gather everyone, feed them, then lay out the new terms. Anyone who doesn't like it can leave and see how far they get without a reference." The meeting ended with laughter and the sound of glasses being refilled. Mercy Cato stood at the kitchen table with her hands in the pie dough and felt something inside her go very cold and very clear. She had been waiting for nearly 2 years, not knowing what she was waiting for, only knowing that eventually there would be a moment when the cost of acting would be less than the cost of enduring. This was that moment. That night, after the big house went dark and the settlement slept, Mercy returned to the cookhouse. She lit a single candle and opened the drawer beneath the dry sink where she kept her personal belongings. A spare apron, a tin of salve for burns, a small Bible her mother had given her, and a cloth-wrapped bundle the size of a prayer book. Inside the bundle was a ledger she had been keeping for 3 years. The entries began in January of 1866, just after the first wave of violence against freed people in the Delta. Mercy had started recording names, dates, and details of every act of retaliation she witnessed or heard about from the network of black workers who moved between plantations, sharing information in the same way they had once shared escape routes on the Underground Railroad. The ledger contained 142 entries. Whippings, burnings, disappearances, wage theft, fraudulent debts, sexual assaults, murders disguised as accidents or blamed on vague criminals who were never found. 17 of the entries involved men who would be sitting at Marcus Crenshaw's table in 2 nights. Mercy turned to a blank page and wrote a new entry in her careful script, the handwriting she had learned in secret during slavery, teaching herself with scraps of paper and stolen chalk. November 22nd, 1868. Daniel Cato, age 19, murdered February 9th, 1867. Present in the barn, Marcus Crenshaw, Clayton Webb, James Crenshaw. Witnesses, Sarah Trent, cleaning the tack room, myself, called to bring water. No charges filed. Body buried in the settlement cemetery. Official cause of death listed as fever by Dr. Pemberton, who did not examine the body. Justice denied by silence. Justice delayed by fear. Justice will come by other means. She closed the ledger and wrapped it again in the cloth. Then she pulled out a second bundle, smaller, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath the false bottom of the drawer. Inside were 4 small glass bottles, each one labeled in her mother's handwriting, brought north from Louisiana during slavery, when Mercy's family had been sold to the Crenshaws. The labels read, Tansy, Pennyroyal, Nightshade, Foxglove. Mercy had been raised by a woman who knew plants, who understood that the same herbs that could ease pain or bring down fever could also stop a heart or paralyze lungs, depending on the dose and the method of preparation. Her mother had taught her these things in whispers, not as weapons, but as knowledge that might someday mean the difference between life and death, between enduring and escaping. She had never used them, not during slavery, when the cost of rebellion was torture and sale. Not during the war, when the possibility of freedom kept hope alive. Not in the 3 years since emancipation, when the Freedmen's Bureau and the federal troops and the new amendments to the Constitution were supposed to mean that justice could come through legal channels. But Daniel was dead. The winter tally meant more families would be destroyed, and justice was not coming through legal channels because the law was enforced by men who saw black suffering as either deserved or invisible. Mercy selected one bottle, the one labeled Nightshade, and held it up to the candlelight. The liquid inside was dark as old blood, concentrated through a process her mother had showed her decades ago. A single drop would cause nausea. 3 drops would cause convulsions. A teaspoon would stop the heart within an hour. She had 11 pies to make for Thanksgiving. 11 men had been in that meeting, laughing about the winter tally, planning to drive families into starvation as if it were no more significant than deciding which fields to plant in the spring. Tomorrow, she would begin baking. By the morning of November 23rd, everyone in the workers' settlement understood that something was about to happen, even if they did not know exactly what. The knowledge moved through the community in the way information always moved among people who had learned to communicate without words, who could read meaning in the angle of a shoulder or the duration of a glance. Mercy Cato had not told anyone her plan. Telling meant complicity, meant shared guilt, meant more people at risk. But people sensed the shift in her the way animals sense a coming storm. Sarah Trent noticed it first. She had worked alongside Mercy for 30 years and knew the rhythms of her silence. On the morning of the 23rd, when they began preparing the pies in the cookhouse, Sarah watched Mercy's hands as she rolled the crusts and realized they were not shaking. This was significant because Mercy's hands had shaken every day since Daniel's death. A tremor she could not control that made her grip things too tightly and set down dishes with excessive care. But today, measuring out the flour and sugar, her hands were steady as stone. Sarah said nothing. She simply moved through her tasks with quiet efficiency and made sure she was never in the cookhouse alone, always accompanied by Ruth or Abigail, making it impossible for anyone to later claim that she had been the one to tamper with the food. Abigail Foster noticed the way Mercy checked and rechecked the labels on the spice jars, holding each one up to the light, studying them with the focus of someone following a recipe she had memorized, but wanted to execute perfectly. Abigail had been a midwife before the war, had delivered babies and tended the sick, had her own knowledge of plants and their properties. She recognized the scent that clung faintly to Mercy's hands that morning. Not the usual smells of butter and cinnamon, but something else underneath. Bitter and green. The smell of crushed leaves that did not belong in any pie. Abigail said nothing. She took the collard greens she had harvested and began preparing them in a pot on the stove. Working at the far end of the kitchen, creating distance between herself and the pies. Ruth Parsons noticed that Mercy prepared 2 sets of desserts, 11 pies with lattice crusts, each one marked with a small notch on the rim in a pattern only someone looking closely would see, and 7 pies with solid crusts, unmarked, set on a different shelf in the pie safe. When Clayton Webb came through the cookhouse at midday to inspect the preparations, Mercy showed him the solid crust pies, explaining that these would be served to the workers who attended the feast, while the lattice crust pies, more elaborate and time-consuming, were reserved for the white guests at the main table. Webb nodded approval and left, never asking why the portions were divided in that precise ratio, 11 and 7. That afternoon, Reverend Thomas Ashford came to the settlement to hold a prayer service at the small church the freed people had built from scrap lumber and determination. 40 people attended, packed into the one-room structure that smelled of sawdust and hymn books, donated by a northern missionary society. Ashford preached from the book of Exodus, about Moses and the plagues, about Pharaoh's hardness of heart, about the final plague that visited every Egyptian household and left the firstborn dead. His voice carried through the open door and across the settlement, and everyone who heard it understood that he was not talking about ancient Egypt. After the service, Ashford stood outside the church and spoke quietly with Isaiah Johnson, a man in his 30s who had served in the Union Army with the U.S. colored troops and returned to the Delta with ideas about voting and land ownership and the rights that the Constitution supposedly guaranteed. Isaiah had been marked in Clayton Webb's winter tally as a troublemaker, someone to be removed. "Are you planning to attend tomorrow night?" Ashford asked. Isaiah nodded. "We've been invited, expected to come. Refusing means trouble. And if you go, there may be different trouble." "There's always trouble," Isaiah said. "The question is what kind we can live with and what kind we can't." Ashford placed a hand on Isaiah's shoulder. "Tomorrow night, whatever happens, remember that the Lord sees everything, every act, every silence, every choice. And remember that sometimes His justice comes through human hands. What would you do if you knew something terrible was about to happen, but stopping it meant exposing yourself and everyone you loved to retaliation?" The people of the settlement had been making versions of this choice for their entire lives, calculating risks, weighing the cost of action against the cost of complicity, surviving in a world that punished both. Tomorrow night, some of them would make different calculations. Thanksgiving morning dawned cold and clear, the sky the color of skim milk, the air carrying the first real bite of winter. The temperature dropped into the 30s by noon, unusual for the Delta, where November typically held on to the last warmth of autumn. The cold was enough to require fires in every room of the big house, and Marcus Crenshaw ordered extra wood brought in from the timber lot, determined that his Thanksgiving gathering would be remembered for its warmth and abundance. The dining room at Belmont could seat 30 people when both leaves were installed in the mahogany table that had been in the Crenshaw family since before the war. For this feast, Marcus had it set for 23, himself at the head, his 2 sons on either side, Clayton Webb and the 3 foremen, 4 business associates from neighboring plantations, 3 county officials, including the sheriff and the tax assessor, a lawyer named Thaddeus Bragg, who handled the plantation's legal affairs, and Reverend Silas Kenner, the white Methodist minister from Greenville who believed that Christianity required submission to earthly authority and frequently preached on the curse of Ham as justification for racial hierarchy. 7 more places were set at a separate table in the adjoining parlor, intended for the black workers who would be permitted to attend as audience rather than guests. Positioned where they could see the main table through the wide doorway, but remain symbolically apart. Marcus had explained this arrangement to Clayton Webb with satisfaction. They need to see us together, unified, in control. They need to understand that the war changed the law, but it didn't change the natural order. By 4 in the afternoon, the house had been transformed. Every chandelier blazed with candles. The fireplaces roared. The smell of roasting turkey and baking bread filled every room. The table was set with the Crenshaw silver and the good china that had been buried in the garden during the war to keep it from being stolen by Union troops. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight. Linen napkins were folded into precise triangles at each place. Mercy Cato moved through the house like a ghost, directing Sarah and Abigail and Ruth, placing serving dishes, checking temperatures, making final adjustments to the meal that had taken days to prepare. She wore her best dress, a simple gray garment she had sewn herself, and a white apron starched stiff. Her face showed nothing. Her hands remained steady. At 5:30, the guests began arriving. Carriages rolled up the drive, men in wool suits and women in silk dresses, though the women would not be staying for the meal. This was an evening of business and politics, not social entertaining. The wives were deposited at neighboring plantations to take tea while their husbands gathered at Belmont to discuss the future of the Delta and the management of the labor force that would determine whether that future was profitable. By 6, all 23 men were present, standing in the front parlor with glasses of whiskey, their voices rising in volume as they worked through the second and third rounds of drinks. The conversation was comfortable, familiar, the talk of men who believed themselves masters of their world. Cotton prices, labor contracts, the upcoming elections, the failure of Congress to adequately protect property rights, the need for stronger local control now that federal troops were being withdrawn. Marcus Crenshaw circulated among them, playing the host, making introductions, steering conversations toward the topic he wanted to address after the meal. The formation of a county-wide agricultural association that would establish uniform wage rates and labor policies, preventing workers from playing one plantation against another, creating a system that would function as effectively as slavery had, without technically violating the 13th Amendment. At 6:30, Clayton Webb rang the dinner bell, and the men moved toward the dining room. The workers from the settlement arrived just as the white guests were seating themselves. They came in a group of 7, moving with the hesitant formality of people entering a space where they were not welcome, but could not refuse entry. Isaiah Johnson led them, followed by his wife Elizabeth, then Marcus Davis and his teenage son Thomas, and 3 other men whose families had worked Belmont land for generations. They stood in the doorway of the parlor, waiting to be acknowledged, while the white men at the main table ignored them with practiced ease. Mercy and the other kitchen workers began bringing out the food: turkey on a massive platter, ham glazed with honey and studded with cloves, bowls of steaming vegetables, baskets of cornbread. The table filled with abundance, each dish placed with care. The choreography of service performed with the precision that came from decades of practice. When everything was ready, Marcus Crenshaw stood at the head of the table and raised his hand for silence. The conversation died down. The 7 workers in the adjoining parlor stood frozen, not sure whether they were supposed to sit at their own table or remain standing. "Gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "We gather tonight in gratitude for this harvest, for the restoration of peace to our land, and for the opportunity to continue the work that our fathers began. 3 years ago, our society was disrupted by forces beyond our control. We faced invasion, defeat, and the imposition of laws that threatened to destroy everything we had built." He paused, letting the words settle, his eyes moving across the faces of the men at the table, all of them nodding in agreement. "But we have endured," he continued. "We have adapted. We have found ways to preserve the essential order of things within the bounds of the new regulations. And we have done so through unity, through mutual support, and through our unwavering commitment to the principles that have always guided our actions." In the parlor doorway, Isaiah Johnson listened with his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. Elizabeth placed a hand on his arm, a silent warning not to react. "Tonight," Marcus said, "we celebrate not just a harvest, but a victory. The victory of civilization over chaos, of rightful authority over misguided egalitarianism, of those who understand the natural hierarchy of God's creation over those who would seek to overturn it." Reverend Kenner said, "Amen," and several other men echoed him. Marcus raised his glass. "Let us give thanks to the Almighty for his continued blessings, for his wisdom in ordering the world according to his design, and for the strength he grants us to maintain that order in the face of those who would see it destroyed." The men at the table raised their glasses. In the kitchen doorway, Mercy Cato stood with her hands folded over her apron, watching. "Heavenly Father," Reverend Kenner intoned, "we thank you for this bounty, for these men gathered in fellowship, and for the continued prosperity of this land. We ask your blessing on this meal, on this company, and on the work we do in your name. Amen." "Amen," the table responded. Marcus sat down, and the meal began. The first course passed without incident. The men ate with the enthusiasm of people who had worked up an appetite through conversation and whiskey. They praised the turkey, complimented the ham, helped themselves to generous portions of everything. The workers at the separate table ate sparingly, uncomfortable with the whole performance, aware that they were props in a ritual designed to demonstrate their subservience. The conversation at the main table ranged over familiar territory. Sheriff Dawson, a thick-necked man with a face like raw beef, complained about the Freedmen's Bureau interfering with local justice. "They investigate every complaint like it's a federal case. Last week, a colored boy claimed he was cheated on his wages, and I had to spend half a day writing a report for some bureau clerk who's never worked a day in his life." Thaddeus Bragg, the lawyer, offered a solution. "The Bureau's authority is shrinking as the troops withdraw. Give it another year and they'll be reduced to writing letters no one reads. We just need to be patient and maintain our solidarity." James Crenshaw, Marcus's eldest son, was less patient. "I say we make it clear right now that complaints to the Bureau will result in immediate termination and eviction. Word will spread. Workers will understand that their only recourse is to us, and we decide what's fair." Clayton Webb laughed. "Some already understand. The ones who don't are the ones we're letting go after the winter tally." The conversation continued in this vein through the main course, each man contributing his perspective on labor management, on controlling the workforce, on maintaining the social order that had been disrupted but not destroyed by the war and emancipation. They spoke openly because they believed themselves safe among allies, surrounded by people who either agreed with them or had no power to challenge them. In the kitchen, Mercy and Sarah and Abigail and Ruth cleared the main course dishes and prepared to serve dessert. The 11 lattice crust pies had been warming in the pie safe, the sugar and spices releasing their aroma, making the kitchen smell like celebration rather than execution. Mercy placed the first pie on a tray. She cut it into precise slices, 6 slices from each pie, and arranged them on the Crenshaw china. Sarah carried the first tray into the dining room and began serving, moving around the table from left to right, placing each slice in front of its designated recipient. Abigail followed with the second tray, then Ruth with the third. The men at the main table received their dessert with appreciative comments. "Smells wonderful. Best part of the meal. Your cook knows her business, Marcus." The workers at the separate table received their dessert from the unmarked solid crust pies, 7 slices cut from a single pie that Mercy had prepared without any additions beyond flour, sugar, butter, and pumpkin. When everyone had been served, Marcus Crenshaw raised his glass one more time. "To the future," he said. "May it look more like the past than the present." The men at the table raised their glasses and drank. Then they picked up their forks and began to eat. The poison did not act immediately. Mercy had calibrated the dose to allow time, to let the men finish their dessert and begin to relax, to create a window of normalcy before the symptoms started. She needed them to ingest enough, needed to make sure no one stopped after a single bite, and raised an alarm that would allow the others to seek help. 5 minutes passed. The men at the main table finished their pie and leaned back in their chairs, satisfied, ready for the brandy and cigars that traditionally followed a meal like this. The conversation continued, slightly slower now, the edges softened by food and drink. 7 minutes. Clayton Webb reached for his water glass and noticed his hand was trembling slightly. He frowned, shook his head as if to clear it, then lifted the glass and drank. Across the table, one of the foremen, a man named Garrett Lewis, rubbed his eyes and blinked several times, complaining that the candlelight was making everything look blurred. 9 minutes. James Crenshaw stood up, intending to step away from the table, and found his legs unsteady. He gripped the back of his chair, his face suddenly pale, and said, "Father, I don't feel well." Marcus turned toward his son, just as the first wave of nausea hit him. His stomach cramped violently, and he tasted something bitter in the back of his throat. Around the table, other men were beginning to show signs of distress. Sweating, pallor, dilated pupils, trembling hands. Reverend Kenner was the first to vomit, leaning sideways in his chair and retching onto the Persian rug. Sheriff Dawson tried to stand and collapsed, his chair tipping backward, crashing to the floor. Thaddeus Bragg clutched his chest, gasping for air that would not come, his face turning the color of old plaster. Clayton Webb managed to get to his feet, his face twisted in rage and comprehension. He turned toward the kitchen door, toward Mercy Cato standing in the doorway with her hands folded over her apron, and tried to speak. His throat had begun to close, his tongue thick and useless, but he managed a single word. "You." Then his legs folded, and he went down. Chaos erupted in slow motion, like watching a disaster unfold underwater. Men tried to stand and fell. Some crawled toward the door. Others sat frozen in their chairs as their bodies betrayed them. The room filled with the sounds of retching, choking, furniture crashing, glass shattering as water goblets hit the floor. In the parlor, the 7 workers stood paralyzed, watching through the doorway as the white men who had ruled their lives began to die. Isaiah Johnson gripped the back of a chair so hard the wood creaked. Elizabeth covered her mouth with both hands. Marcus Davis, the oldest of the workers present, began to pray in a whisper. Mercy Cato walked into the dining room, moving through the wreckage with steady steps. She looked at each man in turn. Marcus Crenshaw convulsing on the floor at the head of the table, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. James and William Crenshaw sprawled across their chairs, their bodies rigid with seizures. Clayton Webb face down on the rug, one hand still reaching toward the door he had almost made it to. She counted. 11 men down, 12 more still at the table, some of them not having eaten the pie yet, some having taken only a bite or two. Not enough poison to kill them, but enough to make them very sick, enough to incapacitate them, enough to make them understand what was happening and why. From somewhere outside, the sound of voices. More people arriving from the settlement. Not the ones who had been invited to the meal, but others who had been waiting for a signal that had not yet been given but was no longer necessary. The door opened, and 20 more men and women entered the house. Isaiah Johnson was the first to move from the doorway into the dining room. Though moving felt like wading through mud, every step requiring a conscious decision to continue. He crossed the threshold and stood looking at Marcus Crenshaw, who lay on the floor with his eyes open and aware, but his body no longer responding to his commands. The paralysis was setting in, the nightshade working its way through his system, shutting down motor function while leaving consciousness intact. He could see everything. He could hear everything. He could do nothing. Isaiah knelt beside Marcus, not to help, but to make sure the man understood what was happening. "You're dying," Isaiah said, his voice quiet but clear. The same way you let people die. The same way you killed Daniel Cato and all the others whose names you didn't bother to learn. You're dying, and there's nothing anyone can do to stop it now. Marcus's eyes moved, tracking Isaiah's face, filled with rage and terror, and the beginning understanding that his power had been an illusion all along, dependent on systems and laws and social agreements that only worked when everyone pretended they were natural and inevitable. Once people stopped pretending, once someone like Mercy Cato decided the cost of action was finally less than the cost of endurance, all of it collapsed. The other workers entered the room, spreading out, looking at the scene with expressions that ranged from horror to satisfaction to something more complicated, a mix of relief and guilt, and the knowledge that whatever happened next, they were all implicated in it now. Reverend Ashford came through the front door, summoned by someone from the settlement, and stopped when he saw the bodies, living and dead, arranged around the table like a tableau of judgment. "Dear God," he whispered. Mercy turned to face him. "Not God," she said. "Me." For a long moment, no one spoke. The house was filled with the sounds of dying men and the tick of the grandfather clock in the hall and the crackle of fires in the hearths. Outside, more people were arriving, drawn by some invisible signal that spread through the settlement faster than any bell or messenger. Sarah Trent broke the silence. "We need to decide what happens next." It was the question they had all been avoiding, the question that transformed this from an act of individual revenge into something larger and more dangerous. The killing was done, but the consequences were just beginning. There were 12 men at the table who had not eaten enough poison to die, who were witnesses, who could testify. There were 7 workers who had been in the room when it happened. There were 20 more who had just entered and would be seen as accomplices. And there was a dead sheriff, a dead county official, dead landowners whose families would demand justice and would have the power to inflict it. "We run," Elizabeth Johnson said. "All of us. We take what we can carry, and we leave tonight. Get as far away as possible before anyone finds this." "And go where?" Marcus Davis asked. "They'll hunt us. They'll put out notices. They'll use the law and the militias and the night riders. Running just means dying tired. Staying means dying here," Thomas Davis said, Marcus's son, 18 years old and terrified. "They'll burn the settlement. They'll hang everyone." Isaiah stood up from where he knelt beside Marcus Crenshaw. "Maybe. Or maybe we make it so they can't." "What does that mean?" Ashford asked. Isaiah walked to the window and looked out at the dark yard where more people were gathering. Families from the settlement, 50 or 60 people now, all of them understanding that something had happened in the big house that would change everything. "It means we don't leave witnesses. It means we don't leave evidence. It means we make sure the story that gets told is the one we want told." The 12 men still alive at the table heard this, and those who were still capable of fear felt it now. The decision was made without ever being stated explicitly. It emerged from the collective silence, from the way people moved and looked at each other and understood what needed to be done without needing to say it. There was no vote, no debate, no formal agreement. There was only the knowledge that halfway mercy was the same as suicide, that leaving witnesses meant leaving weapons for people who would use them without hesitation. Mercy Cato was the one who walked to each of the 12 surviving men and looked at them with the same steady gaze she had given Marcus Crenshaw. She did not speak. She simply assessed each one, determining who had eaten enough poison to die within the hour and who would need additional help to reach the same end. Then she returned to the kitchen and came back with a pillow from one of the servants' quarters. No one asked what she was going to do with it. No one tried to stop her. She worked methodically, starting with the ones who were most conscious, most capable of resistance. She placed the pillow over their faces and pressed down until the struggling stopped. Some of the workers turned away, others watched. Isaiah Johnson helped, holding down the arms of one man who tried to fight. Marcus Davis held the legs of another. The killing took 40 minutes. When it was finished, 23 men lay dead around the Thanksgiving table, their bodies arranged in poses that would later seem choreographed. 11 reaching toward the centerpiece, 12 slumped in their chairs or on the floor. The workers stood among them, breathing hard, their hands shaking now that it was done, the enormity of what they had just participated in beginning to settle over them like ash. Abigail Foster said what everyone was thinking. They'll kill us all for this. Our families, our children, everyone. Only if they know we did it, Isaiah replied. How can they not know? We were here. We were invited. There are records. Isaiah looked at Mercy. Were there? Were we officially invited or were we ordered to come? Mercy understood what he was asking. Clayton Webb told people verbally, there's nothing written. And the food? Can they trace the poison? Nightshade breaks down after death. The symptoms look like seizures or heart failure. If the bodies aren't examined immediately, if they're prepared for burial the way white families usually do it, embalming, quick burial because of the smell, there won't be anything to find. Isaiah nodded. Then we need to make this look like something else. An accident, a tragedy, something that doesn't point to us. How? Thomas Davis asked. There's 23 bodies. There's no accident that kills 23 men at a dinner table. Ruth Parsons spoke for the first time since the killing began. Poisoned food from tainted meat or spoiled preserves. It happens. Botulism, bad shellfish, contaminated water. The whole table eats the same thing. Everyone gets sick, the strong survive and the weak die. We've heard of it before. Not 23 dead, Thomas countered. That's too many. No one will believe it. They'll believe what makes sense to them, Mercy said quietly. White men don't believe black women have the knowledge or the courage to do what I just did. They'll look for explanations that fit their understanding of the world. Our job is to make sure those explanations are available. The plan came together in pieces. They would clean the room, remove any signs of struggle. They would take the 11 poisoned pies and the serving dishes and destroy them completely, bury them in the swamp where nothing would be found. They would leave the solid crust pies in the kitchen untouched, along with all the other food from the meal. They would place the bodies in positions that suggested sudden illness rather than violence. No bruising, no signs of suffocation. Just men who had been enjoying a meal and been struck down by something no one could have anticipated. And they would leave one piece of evidence, carefully placed. Mercy's ledger, open to a page that listed names and dates, hidden in the ashes of the cookhouse fireplace where it would be found by investigators, but would look like something the victims had been keeping, not the cook. The handwriting was careful, educated, the kind of script a plantation owner might use to document deaths or grievances. The entries were damning, but they pointed inward, toward secrets the white men had been keeping from each other, toward betrayals and frauds that would make investigators focus on their relationships with each other, rather than their relationships with the people who had fed them. They'll think someone at the table poisoned the others, Sarah said, understanding. They'll think it was about money or property or grudges. They'll investigate each other. And while they do, Isaiah said, we'll be exactly where we've always been. working the land, keeping our heads down, giving them no reason to look at us? It was not a guarantee of safety. Nothing could guarantee safety in a world where white rage could burn down entire communities on suspicion alone. But it was a chance, and a chance was more than they had ever been given before. The cleanup took until dawn. Every dish was washed, every surface scrubbed, every trace of the 11 poisoned pies removed from the premises. The workers moved through the house with the efficiency of people who had spent their lives making white spaces pristine, erasing their own presence, becoming invisible. They knew how to clean a room so thoroughly that no one could prove they had ever been in it. The bodies were arranged with care. Marcus Crenshaw was placed back in his chair at the head of the table, his head tilted back as if he had been looking at the ceiling when the seizure took him. His sons were on either side, slumped forward slightly. Clayton Webb was positioned near the door, as if he had been trying to get help when he collapsed. The others were scattered in ways that suggested panic and confusion, but not violence. The servant's bell rope was the final touch. Isaiah tied 11 knots in it, evenly spaced, each one a marker of death, but also a symbol that anyone might interpret in different ways. A tally, a warning, a mourning ritual. It could mean anything or nothing, and that ambiguity would protect them. At 5 a.m, with the sky beginning to lighten in the east, the workers left the big house and returned to the settlement. They gathered in the church, all 53 families, and Reverend Ashford led them in prayer. Not the prayer of people seeking forgiveness, but the prayer of people acknowledging what they had done and asking for strength to live with it. "We have walked through the valley of the shadow of death," Ashford said, his voice steady despite his own shaking hands. "We have done what survival required. We have become what they made us. And now we must live as if this night never happened. As if we know nothing. As if we are still the people they believe us to be." He paused, looking at each face in the crowded room. "Some of you will carry guilt. Some will carry satisfaction. Some will carry both. All of you will carry silence. That is the price of what we have done. Silence, forever, about this night." "And if they come for us anyway?" someone asked. "If they burn us out, hang us, drive us away?" "Then we will face it together," Ashford said. "But we will not confess. We will not give them the satisfaction of knowing how we beat them. We will let them search for answers in all the wrong places while we build our lives in the spaces they cannot see." At 7 a.m, a farmhand from a neighboring plantation, coming to deliver a message about a shared equipment purchase, found the scene at Belmont. He ran screaming to the settlement, where he encountered Isaiah Johnson and several other men who were ostensibly beginning their day's work in the fields. "Something's happened at the big house," the farmhand gasped. "Everyone's dead. All the white folks, just dead at the table." Isaiah and the others ran with him to the house, their shock and horror perfectly calibrated to appear genuine. They burst into the dining room and stopped, staring at the bodies, and someone, Thomas Davis, who would later realize he had a gift for performance, let out a wail of grief so convincing that the farmhand would later tell investigators he had no doubt the colored workers were devastated by their master's death. The county marshal arrived by mid-morning, a man named Vernon Fletcher, who had served in the Confederate cavalry and viewed Reconstruction as a temporary imposition that would eventually be corrected. He surveyed the scene with the grim efficiency of someone who had seen too much death during the war to be shocked by it. But even he was unsettled by the tableau. 23 men dead at a Thanksgiving table. No signs of violence. No obvious cause. He questioned the workers individually, looking for inconsistencies, watching for the telltale signs of guilt or knowledge. But everyone told the same story. They had been invited to attend the feast. They had been seated in the adjoining parlor. They had been served food from a different set of dishes. They had been present when the white men began to show signs of distress, had tried to help, had run to the settlement for assistance. By the time they returned, everyone was dead or dying. "And the food?" Fletcher asked Mercy Cato, his eyes hard and searching. "You prepared everything?" "Yes, sir," Mercy replied, her voice steady, her face showing nothing. "Been cooking for this family for near 40 years. Never had anyone take sick from my kitchen before. There's a first time for everything." "Yes, sir, I suppose there is." Fletcher examined the kitchen, the pantry, the supplies. He found nothing suspicious. The remaining pies, the 7 solid crust ones that had been served to the workers, sat on the shelf where they had been left. He cut into one and smelled it, tasted a small bite and detected nothing unusual. "Why didn't the workers get sick?" he asked. "They ate the same meal." "Different dessert," Mercy explained. "The lattice crust pies were for the white guests. Took more time to make, more expensive ingredients. The workers got plain pumpkin pies from a different batch." Fletcher wanted to disbelieve her, wanted to find evidence of conspiracy, but nothing supported it. The workers' table showed no signs of illness. The food they had been served was demonstrably safe, and the idea that a black cook, a woman who had been enslaved until 3 years ago, could orchestrate the murder of 23 white men seemed so improbable that he dismissed it almost immediately. He looked instead for other explanations. Had one of the white guests poisoned the others? Had there been a business dispute, a grudge, a conspiracy among them that had turned murderous? He examined the bodies for signs of injection or force. Found nothing. He searched the house for hidden poisons or weapons. Found nothing. And then, in the ashes of the cookhouse fireplace, he found the ledger. It took him 3 hours to read through the entries, his face growing darker with each page. The ledger documented financial frauds, land thefts, illegal dealings with Confederate sympathizers, acts that would have ruined reputations and ended careers if they had become public. It showed Marcus Crenshaw systematically cheating his business partners, Clayton Webb embezzling from the Plantation accounts, Sheriff Dawson taking bribes to ignore crimes. It showed a network of corruption among the very men who lay dead in the dining room. "Someone at that table knew about this," Fletcher said to his deputy, a young man named Harris who was taking notes. "Someone discovered the fraud and decided to eliminate everyone involved. But who? They're all dead. Maybe not all. Maybe one of them didn't eat the pie or ate less than the others. Maybe someone survived long enough to escape and died later." It was the wrong theory, but it was a theory that made sense within Fletcher's understanding of the world. White men betrayed by white men. White men killed for white reasons. It fit his expectations, confirmed his beliefs about where power and violence resided. He never seriously considered that the answer might be standing in the kitchen doorway with her hands folded over her apron, watching him search for clues she had planted specifically to lead him away from the truth. The investigation continued for 6 weeks. Marshal Fletcher interviewed everyone who had been at Belmont that night, examined every document he could find, followed every lead suggested by the ledger he had discovered in the ashes. He became convinced that the murders had been committed by one of the victims, someone who had attended the dinner specifically to poison his Confederates before dying himself, though he could never determine which man had been the killer or what his ultimate motive had been. The newspapers carried the story for 3 weeks. Thanksgiving Massacre at Belmont Plantation. 23 dead in mysterious poisoning. Corruption and death in the Delta. The coverage focused on the financial scandals documented in the ledger, on the possibility of betrayal among the white elite, on the breakdown of social order in the post-war South. Editorials warned about the dangers of greed and corruption, about the need for stronger moral leadership, about the uncertainty of these Reconstruction years. No one seriously proposed that the black workers might have been responsible. A few voices suggested it in whispers, but those whispers were dismissed as paranoid or as attempts to deflect from the real corruption that had been exposed. The idea that enslaved people, even formerly enslaved people, could organize such a sophisticated revenge, could plan and execute mass murder without leaving evidence, was simply beyond what most white people could imagine. Mercy Cato was questioned 3 times. Each time she told the same story in the same steady voice. Each time, Fletcher let her go, unable to find any evidence connecting her to the deaths. After the 3rd interview, he told her she was free to leave Belmont if she wished, that she was no longer needed for the investigation. She left the next day, walking away from the plantation where she had spent 38 years of her life. She took with her only what she could carry: a small bag of clothes, her mother's Bible, and the memory of 11 men choking on pie she had baked with her own hands. She went north, up through Tennessee and Kentucky, following the same routes that escaped slaves had used before the war, staying in black communities that asked no questions and offered help to anyone who needed it. By spring of 1869, she had reached Ohio, where she found work as a cook in a restaurant run by a formerly enslaved couple who understood that everyone who came north was running from something, and that the past was a burden people carried differently. She lived another 23 years, dying in 1891 at the age of 75. She never spoke publicly about Thanksgiving of 1868, but in the months before her death, when she was confined to bed and attended by a young black nurse named Anna Freeman, she told the story once in its entirety and made Anna promise to write it down, but not to share it until everyone who might be hurt by the revelation was dead. Anna kept that promise. The written account remained in her family for 3 generations before being donated to a historical archive in 1972, where it was filed among thousands of other oral histories from formerly enslaved people and their descendants. The workers who had been at Belmont that night scattered over the following year. Some went north, others moved to different parts of Mississippi or to neighboring states, finding work on other plantations or in the towns that were growing as the Delta recovered from the war. A few stayed in the area, living quiet lives, becoming landowners themselves as Reconstruction created brief opportunities for black prosperity before the backlash of the 1870s and the rise of Jim Crow closed those opportunities again. None of them confessed, not to family, not to friends, not on deathbeds. The silence Reverend Ashford had asked for held for over a century, broken only by fragments of stories passed down through families, whispers and hints that something had happened at Belmont Plantation on Thanksgiving of 1868, something that involved justice of a kind that could not be spoken about openly. Belmont Plantation was sold at auction in 1869, purchased by a cotton broker from Memphis who had no connection to the Crenshaw family and no knowledge of the property's history beyond what the newspapers had reported. He ran it as a commercial operation, hiring managers and foremen, paying wages slightly higher than the regional average to attract workers who were willing to work land that now had a reputation for death and corruption. The big house was cleaned and repainted, the dining room restored to its former elegance. New families moved into the overseer cottages. The workers' settlement was rebuilt with better cabins, though the people who lived in them still earned barely enough to survive. The 11-knotted bell rope disappeared, cut down and burned by someone who understood its significance, even if they did not know its precise meaning. The Crenshaw silver and china were sold off, piece by piece. The grandfather clock was purchased by a judge in Greenville and continued ticking in a different house, marking time in a world that had changed in ways both profound and superficial. By 1875, when Reconstruction officially ended and federal troops were withdrawn from the South, the story of the Belmont Thanksgiving Massacre had become folklore, told in different versions depending on who was telling it. White families spoke of it as a cautionary tale about corruption and greed, about men who had betrayed each other and paid the ultimate price. Black families told different versions, quieter versions, about justice that came through means that could not be named, about resistance that looked like submission until the moment it didn't. The truth remained buried, not in the earth like the bodies of the victims, but in the silence of the people who knew what had happened and chose to protect that knowledge rather than expose it. That silence was not weakness. It was strategy, survival, the recognition that some victories had to remain invisible to everyone except those who had fought for them. The dining room table from Belmont Plantation still exists. It was sold at auction in 1923, purchased by an antiques dealer in New Orleans, and resold several more times over the decades. It sits now in a museum of Southern history, displayed as an example of pre-war craftsmanship, with a small placard noting that it was part of the furnishings from a plantation that was the site of a notorious mass poisoning in 1868. Visitors walk past it every day, admiring the mahogany grain and the carved legs, never knowing that 23 men died eating from it, never knowing that the poisoning was not a mysterious accident or a case of corruption among white men, but a deliberate act of revenge carried out by a woman whose name appears nowhere in the historical record, except as Colored Cook, first name Mercy, surname Cato. The ledger that Marshall Fletcher found in the ashes was eventually donated to the state archives, where it remains available for researchers studying Reconstruction-era financial corruption. The entries are genuine. Marcus Crenshaw and his associates had indeed been involved in the frauds documented, but the ledger was not kept by them. It was kept by Mercy Cato, who had learned to read and write in secret and had spent 3 years documenting every act of violence and injustice she witnessed, knowing that someday the evidence might be useful, never imagining it would be useful as a diversion rather than an indictment. Anna Freeman's written account of Mercy's confession, preserved for a century and donated to an archive in 1972, was discovered by a graduate student in 2007. The student brought it to the attention of her advisor, who brought it to the attention of the Historical Society in Mississippi, who quietly filed it away without making any public announcement because the implications were too uncomfortable. The questions it raised too difficult to answer. How many other acts of resistance went unrecorded, dismissed as accidents or attributed to causes that had nothing to do with the will and agency of the people who had been enslaved? How many times did justice come through means that could not be acknowledged, because acknowledging them would have resulted in collective punishment? How many people carried knowledge of violence and counter-violence to their graves, protecting not just themselves but entire communities from retaliation? The answers, like so much else from that era, remain buried in silence and speculation. But on November nights in the Mississippi Delta, when the air turns cold and the wind carries the smell of wood smoke and cooking fires, some people still tell stories about a Thanksgiving feast that ended in death. About a cook who understood that patience and knowledge could be more powerful than any weapon. About justice that came not from courts or laws, but from the careful preparation of 11 pies. They say you can still hear the clock ticking in the empty big house. Still see 11 knots in the rope that was cut down and burned over a century ago. Still taste something bitter in the November air when you stand where the cookhouse used to be. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.